What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Kilo Loco, and today I'm going to be showing you how to log in to your own custom backend database using URLSessions. Now, your backend might be, coded in PHP, Go, JavaScript. Hell, it might even be coded in Swift. That's what my backend is coded in. So I'm actually going to show you how to log in. You already have this user all set up and signed up, and I'm going to actually show you how to log in, assuming that all you need to do is make a post request to your database, and that will give you all the information you need for your app to log in and go to the main part of the app. So as you can see, we're going to be working with this general setup, just your typical login screen where it has a username and a password and the login button. So let's jump in. But before we jump in, I just want to say, make sure you head over to kiloloco.com if you haven't already and see if there's anything here that might be of value for you. Maybe a course, maybe the all access membership where you get access to me via Slack, or maybe you just want to help out the channel. So make sure you check that out, and let's jump right on into it. So as you already saw, we have our UI set up, and it's just a simple table view controller, and this is our login view controller that's going to be managing all that for us. Now, as you can see, we already have the username and password text fields set up, and we also have the login button set up. And in the login button functionality right now, all we're doing is unwrapping the username and password, and we're just printing them out. So if I were to jump back over to the app and enter in my information, and now that I have my information entered in and then I hit login, we'll actually be able to see the credentials. So we have Kilo Loco as the username and pass123 as the login. Now, if you want to use my backend to practice this, you most certainly are welcome. And let me show you that. I actually have Postman pulled up right here, which is just a tool to do networking requests for get, post, update, delete, all those other things. So as you can see, this is my this is my endpoint right here, kiloloco.herokuapp.com. And if you do /API/users, you can see all the users. Now I only have one user in here, and as you can see, it's giving us back all the information, the ID, the username, the age, name, and password. Now normally you wouldn't give back the password, but in this case, we're trying to log in and we needed an example, so I am giving back the password. So if I were to run a post request on my login endpoint, right here, as you can see, it's /API/login. All I have to do is make sure that I'm entering in the username, which is Kilo Loco, the password, which is pass123, and then when we send that, we're going to get back a user object, and our user object we should be expecting to get back without the password included. So I did that as well. So let's go ahead and look at what we have for our actual app right now. And as I already said, that's what the login button is going to eventually be doing. And then lastly, we just have a segue, since we're going to be using storyboards on this one, just so that we can demonstrate that we're going into the main part of the app. So there are a couple of other things that we have in here. The alert service, which is just going to handle us doing the pop-ups for us. And then we have a networking service, which actually doesn't have anything in here. And then if you guys want the starter project, link is in the description. You can download it for free. This is where we're going to be writing all of our logic. The last thing that I just want to show you is that we do have a user object, and I want to state that this is a decodable object. So we will be able to decode our response into a user object when we get there. So let's jump over to the networking service. And now let's talk about what we expect to go on in here. So for our networking service, we're expecting to be able to obviously do networking. We're going to be making a request that's going to go out to the internet. It's going to hit our endpoint, and then it's supposed to return back the response. So what we want to do is we want to create a function that's going to be called request. So let's do that now. And before I go any further, I just want to say that we are going to actually end up with two request functions, one to do the two different types of post requests that you would normally come across. We're going to do a form data request, and we're also going to do a JSON request. So the form data request we're going to work on first. And when we have a request, we need to be able to return something in a closure, essentially, because the code that we get back, we're gonna go out to the internet, right? And we don't know when that code is gonna come back. We don't know when the API is gonna send us a response back. And by the time it sends it back, this function will have already finished executing because the networking request is done on a background thread. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have a closure that is going to be able to still run code even after this function has finished running. All right, so what we ended up doing was we have a completion. We have an argument called completion, which is taking an enclosure, and the @escaping is essentially specifying what I just said, where we don't know when the request is going to come back. It might take, 3 milliseconds. It might take 3 seconds. It might take 3 minutes. Who knows? So once it does come back, we need to make sure that we're able to run this closure, and we know that this closure is going to happen sometime after this function's already finished. Now, another thing that we need to know is what endpoint are we calling? So we need to make sure that we pass that in as an argument as well. So we know that we need an endpoint, and we know that we need to have a completion handler or a closure to pass the data through whenever we're calling this request function, which is going to be called in our view controller. Now, one thing that I also forgot to mention is that we're going to need to have something be sent back to us wherever we're calling this request function, which, like I said, is going to be in the view controller. We need to have it send back that data, the information that we want. So I'm actually going to make sure that inside of the closure, the argument that's being passed in is going to be a result. And result in Swift 5, which you're going to see, has 2 generic parameters which we can pass into it. So let's add that now. All right, so as you can see, we want a result that's going to return back a user in the event of a success, but it's also going to return back an error in case, we run into an error, right? Now, if you're using anything below Swift 5, what you can do is you could create a result type, Enum, that will essentially represent this, what I'm working with, since this is Swift 5. So let me show you how to do that real quick. All right, so now this would be essentially what you could replace result with. You can make it my result, or you could call it result yourself if you want, since you don't have access to this object, since it's only available in Swift 5. But essentially, all you would have to do is put my result right here, and you'd still be able to follow along exactly what I'm doing. So, but I'm going to go back to using result because I am using Swift 5, and let's talk about what's going on right here. So my result has 2 generic parameters. The first one can be anything, and the second one is going to be E, which is going to be of type error. So whatever we pass into a failure has to conform to error. So on a success, we can pass through anything. Failure, we have to pass through anything that conforms to error. And that's essentially the same thing that result is doing right here. All right, so we're good for now. We're still going to add a couple more arguments as we go, but right now this request is looking good enough so that we can actually continue. Now, another thing that we're going to need is a base URL. So in this case, my base URL, as we saw over here in Postman, is going to be essentially this: https://kiloloco.herokuapp.com/API. So that is going to be my base URL, and I just want to make sure that I always have access to that in my networking service. All right, so now that I have my base URL, I can access it anywhere inside of this networking service. And you might choose to use your base URL somewhere else, or maybe even possibly hide it. But for the sake of examples, this is going to work, okay? So next, what we want to do is we actually want to make a actual URL, and a URL object. We don't want to just be working with strings, because in order to do a networking request, we have to use an actual URL. So let's do that. So now that we have a URL object, we can move forward, but the problem is that this URL is actually, whenever we initialize it with the string, it actually returns back an optional URL, and we don't want to work with optionals. We want to be able to handle this and make sure that the URL is an actual URL. And I don't like to force cast it, because that's nasty. But I mean, it should work, but it's just, It's just better to do it this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an error that's specifically designed for my networking service. It's going to be a networking error, and I'm just going to return that as a result for my completion if this URL is invalid. So let's go ahead and add that now. All right, so now we're properly handling the URL. We have a guaranteed URL. And if you guys are a little bit confused on what's going on here, make sure you watch my error handling video, and I go into depth on how all this is kind of playing out. All right, so let's move forward. Now that we have the URL, we want to actually make a request with it. So let's go ahead and make a URL request. All right, so now that we have our URL request object, this is actually where we're going to start plugging in a lot of the different things that is going to specialize our request to be the way that we want it. So we have this request, and what we want to do is we want to specify, okay, what are the parameters that are going to go into this request? Well, in order to actually create parameters, I have to create URL components. I have to pass in all the parameters to it, and then I have to apply it to the body. So let's break that down step by step. The first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we're passing in parameters to our function up here. All right, so now we have parameters being passed in as an argument to our function. And what I'll do is after each of these commas, I'm gonna just do a line break just so that we could clean up and read it a little bit easier, because we're still gonna add a couple more arguments to this request. So now that we have the parameters, what we need to do is we need to break it down so that we can turn it into data. And the way that we're gonna do that is using URL components. Now, URL components have a property on it called query items. So the query items essentially allow us to say what are all the parameters that are associated with this with these components. And what we want to do is we want to create query items, URL query items, plug them into the components, because that's actually going to give us a query string, and that string is what we're going to turn into data. All right, so let's break down what's going on here, because there is a whole lot happening. So as you can see, we have the components, which is created from URL components. And now we have this empty array of query items, right? So we're just going to create an empty array because we're going to actually loop through all the parameters that are being passed to our request function. So all these parameters, we need to loop through them. So we're going to loop through them right here. So for key value in parameters. So this is going to be the key or the name of the it's going to be the left side of the argument of a dictionary, essentially, right? So the key is going to be this side, the value is going to be this side, and we're just looping through each of them. So for key value in parameters, because this is a dictionary, all we need to do to create a URL query item is to pass in a name. The name is going to be the key. The value is going to be the value, but it has to be a string value. You cannot pass in like a number or a boolean or anything. So what we're going to do is, since we don't know what type of value it's going to be, because it could be any value, we're going to be using the string initializer that is called describing. So essentially it will turn any value into a string appropriately. So now we have a URL query item that's being created. We're adding that query item to the query items up here. So as we loop through each of these parameters, we're going to essentially be turning them into this query item object and then appending them to this query items array right here. Once we do that, like I said, the components have a query items property on it, which we're just setting to the query items that we just created right here. So we're setting those to the query items property on the components. And once we do that, as I also said, the components has a property on it called query. Now query is of type string, and what this does is it formats the query items into a query string, which is used in networking. So let me give you an idea of what that looks like. So this is essentially the string that would be printed out if I was going to say my username, the username the username is equal to Kilo Loco and the password is equal to pass123. This is the query string that we get out of it, and that's what we need to convert to data. So now that we're converting this string, which is this query right here, to data using UTF-8, which is the standard encoding for making requests on the internet, we now have this query data. Now we can actually add this to our request. So that's the main part of what you need to do whenever you're doing form requests, is essentially go through this process of creating components, query items, and then getting a string to turn into data so that we can set those as the parameters inside of the request. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if I'm really bad at explaining things and making it too confusing for you guys. All right, so now what we want to do is we also want to add in a couple of other things to our request object. Things such as what type of request this is. So is it a get request, post request, update, delete? Which one is it? So we have a property on request called HTTP method, which accepts a string. And for this example, we're just going to make sure that it's always a post request. So let's add that. So depending on what type of HTTP method you're using, you just need to spell it out in a string and make sure that it's all capitalized, because having it as a lowercase post would not work. The last thing that we want to do is we want to format our request to say, hey, this is the content type. So we need to add a header to our request to let the API know what kind of request we're actually making. So let's go ahead and add in the content type into our headers for the request. So this is the way that we would add headers. And if you had multiple headers, what you could do is you could add in multiple, you could add a argument up here that says headers, and then we could essentially loop through them and do kind of a similar thing that we did right here. So where we would have key and value in headers, we could loop through it, add in the value right here, and add in the key right here, and that would be how you would add multiple headers. But in this example, we actually don't need any additional headers, so this will actually work out quite nicely. Also notice that this is using the same type of header content type as our Postman request, which you'll actually see right here. We're using x-www-form-urlencoded. As opposed to form encoded, which is usually used to pass files like images and stuff like that, or raw and binary. I don't exactly remember what those ones do, but this is the one that we want to make sure that we're passing. So that's just going to be prefixed by the word application / and then whatever encoding that you plan on, or whatever type of request this actually is for the content type. So this is everything that we need to do in order to set up our request. But now what we want to do is we actually want to be able to, send that bad boy out into the world, and we want to get back all of the information. So let's go ahead and actually create a data task, which is essentially the object that is in charge of doing the networking piece, and it's going to go out to the internet. So let's go ahead and create a data task and enter in this request to it. All right, so as you can see, I created a reference to our URL session, the shared URL session, which is perfectly fine for most basic networking requests. And on session, it has this this function called data task, and what it does is it accepts a URL request. So we're going to pass in our URL request, which is what we have right here. And then it also has this completion handler, which we're just going to press enter on so that it can format the closure properly for us. So then we're going to be returning back data, response, and error. So let's give those names now. All right, so now that we have data, response, and error, which are arguments passed into this closure, we can go ahead and use them down here. Now, what I usually like to do is, you see how it's highlighting task and saying that it's been initialized but never used in yellow? I just like to make sure that I say task.resume, And the reason for that is because that's what actually kicks off the networking request and sends it out into the internet. If you forget this step, you're essentially not going to be making the networking request. You'll just be sitting there waiting for something to happen and nothing will happen. So I like to do that before I go in and add all the logic. From here, what we want to do is we want to check the response. And what we want to do is we want to cast this response to a HTTP URL response. And what that's going to allow us to do is check what our status code is on the API request. Did we get a 404 page not found? Did we get a 500 servers down? Did we get a 200, which means that, hey, everything went all gravy and you're good to go. So what we want to do is we want to check this response and make sure that we're getting the correct values. All right, so if for any reason we can't actually grab the response and cast it to a HTTP URL response, then we're just going to run into this block right here, which is going to do a completion, and we're going to just say that it was a failure and that we have a networking error, essentially a bad response, which I added into our networking error as a case just right now. Now, remember that when you went out to the internet and you came back, that might have happened, 0.3 seconds ago. It might have happened 3 seconds ago. We don't know when it happened, and all this stuff is happening on the background thread. Whenever we return, we want to make sure that we're going to be essentially working on a main thread, and I'm going to just make sure that it's on a main thread whenever we kick back the data in our result. So what I'll do is I'll wrap everything that we're going to be doing in a dispatch queue to make sure that we're essentially coming back to the main thread. All right, so now moving forward, we're always going to make sure that anything that's returned in our closure is going to be passed back to the main thread, because if we didn't, it would still be operating on a background thread. And that means if we were to try to update the UI inside wherever we're trying to, inside of the closure of wherever we're calling this request, what would happen is we would get like weird behavior because it's trying to update UI from a background thread, which you're not supposed to do. I think Apple calls it illegal. So next, what we're going to do is, now that this is an unwrapped response, what we want to do is we want to check the status code and make sure that it's anywhere in between 200 and 299. If it's anything other than that, we're going to consider it an error, and we're going to pass it back as an error as well. All right, so as you can see, we're just doing a switch statement on the unwrapped response. We're doing it based off of the status code. The status code is actually an integer, so that gives us the ability to do switch cases using number ranges. So what I'm doing is I'm saying if it's anywhere from 200 all the way up to, but not including 300, that's what this operator does, is up to but not including. Then we're going to say success. If that is not the case, then we're just going to say failure. Now, at this point, we have enough in our actual response, or in our request function, to actually test this out and see if it's going to work. So let's go ahead and go back over to the login view controller, and let's go ahead and try this request out. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to use my networking service right here, and I'm going to actually create parameters out of this username and password, pass it into our networking service.request, and fill out that request function. All right, so as you can see, I have the parameters set up. It's just a dictionary of username and then username and password, whatever is typed in up here. That's why we're unwrapping it there. And what we want to do is we want to pass in the endpoint, which we know is /login. We know that the parameters are obviously the parameters that we just created right here. And then when we get to the completion handler, we're just going to press enter so that it can format our function for us. And we're just going to say that the result, we have to give it a name. I'm going to call it result. So from here, we're all set. All we want to do is just print out the result, which if it's successful, we actually won't be printing anything because we haven't had the success case set up in our networking service. Right here, as you can see, there's only failure cases, like right here, if we can't get the response back, or if we have like a bad URL or something. So we actually don't have a success case. But what should happen is we should get, if it's in between 200 and 300, we should get back a success. And if it's not, then we should get back a failure. I'm also going to print out the status code of the unwrapped response just so that we can see exactly what that status code is. So let's go ahead and run it and see what it looks like now. So first things first, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to Xcode. I'm going to make sure that there's nothing in the logs, which there isn't, and we're going to hit login. Now, obviously there's no username or password stated right here. So when I hit login, we should get a failed request. So as you can see, we got a 400 failure. So it's printing out the status code, and we're printing out just failure right here. And the reason for that is going to be quite simply because we didn't enter in the correct information. Now, if we go ahead and enter in the correct information of my user, I just entered in Kilo Loco and pass 123. Let's go back over here. Let's clear this. Let's press login. And now let's see what comes back. 200 success. So now we know that we're going out to the internet, we're getting back the response, and we're actually handling everything properly so far. So we're able to get a success case, we're able to get a failure case. That's perfect. So now that we can kind of get an idea of where we're at on the API, whether we're getting a success or a failure, now what we want to do is we want to handle the rest of the information that's being passed into our closure. So for the data and the error, we want to be able to handle these. Now, depending on your API, I think it can send back an error, but I think the majority of the time, this error is mainly going to have to do with a URL session and it being able to connect to the internet. So if your API is sending back an error, it technically was successful. It was a successful request, but I don't think that error would actually be coming back under error. It would still be coming back as data. So this is the way that my API is formatted. Everything always comes back under data, regardless of whether it's a 400 or 500 or 200. It's always coming back under data so that you can work with the message that's coming back. So what I want to do is first I want to check to make sure that if there is an error, then we need to just stop right there and do a failure completion. So let's add that in. All right, so as you can see, I'm just simply unwrapping the error, passing it into our completion as a failure, and we're returning. At that point, there's no need to move forward because we hit an error. We know that there won't be anything after that. Now, let's go ahead and do a similar thing with the data. So now that we're unwrapping the data, what I want to do is I need to try to convert this data to JSON so that we can see if we're actually what object we're actually getting back. So let's go ahead and try to convert this unwrapped data to JSON. If we can't convert it to JSON, then let's go ahead and pass another error. All right, so as you can see, we're wrapping it in a do catch block, and we're just going to pass in what we're going to try to do, convert to JSON. If that fails, then we're going to just pass in that error saying that we weren't able to convert to JSON. That's already given to us by default in the catch block. And if we are able to do it, then we're able to print that JSON. So let's go ahead and try to print that JSON. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to go back over to Xcode. I'm going to open up the debug console, and what we're going to do is we're just going to enter in login without actually entering in a username or password, and we should be getting an error back. So now let's go ahead and take a look. So yes, 400 failure, which is, so we get the 400, which is being printed by the unwrapped response. We're getting failure, which is being printed out because 400 doesn't fall in between 200 and 300. And then we are not getting an unwrapped error. We're actually getting this down here. As I stated before, my API sends back JSON regardless. So if it's an error, then what we're going to do is we're still going to send back JSON, and it's going to be formatted like this. And if it's successful, we're still going to send back JSON, but it's going to be in, whatever the API's expected format is going to be. So let's go ahead and do a successful request by using the correct credentials. I'm just going to throw away all that garbage down there, and we're going to just go ahead and log in properly. All right, and now that we have our username and password correct, we're gonna log in and we're gonna see that we're getting 200. Once again, status code, we're getting success, and we're getting back this object, which is gonna essentially be a user object. So now what we need to do is we need to try to unwrap our object, and we need to essentially do that so that we're either getting back a user or we're going to get back an error. So before we continue, let's go ahead and make sure that we're getting an incorrect object, right? So kilo loco with the 0 at the end, that's going to give us a failed. And let's take a look at our JSON. So our JSON's giving us back two properties: error, which is a number, and a reason, which is a string. So let's go ahead and create an object that this can be decoded into so that we can pass it through our completion handler up here, up all the way at the top right here. So we want to be able to pass an error. So let's go ahead and open up a new file and create a error response. So as you can see, we have this error response, which is going to conform to the decodable protocol. And it's essentially going to allow us to take this JSON right here, convert it into this object. Now, what we want to do is we want to make sure that this error response can actually be converted to a real error. So what I'm going to do is, in an extension, I'm going to add a property to it, a computed property, which is going to return an NS error so that we can pass that through to through our completion handler. So let's go back over to our networking service, and let's go ahead and try to attempt to turn this into a user object. And if we can't turn it into a user object, then let's go ahead and try and turn it into an error object. And if that fails, then we need to make sure that we're going to essentially throw it into the catch block. All right, so as you can see, we're going to try to convert this unwrapped data into a user object using the JSON decoder. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to the try optional. This means that we're going to attempt to do this, but if we can't, then what's going to happen is, since it's part of this if statement, it's actually going to fail and it's going to run this code. Now, I also want you to pay attention to the fact that I actually didn't use an optional try right here, because if it can't create a user, it better be able to create an error response object and, from the unwrapped data using the JSON decoder. Because if it can't do that, then we have real problems. And what's actually going to happen is that this code will now run, since this is just a standard try. So if this tries and it fails, then this catch block will actually catch it, and it will return back the response saying why it was unable to decode this error response. So now we've done essentially everything that we needed to do to handle all the decoding and the request of our request function. So let's break this down a little bit one more time. As we're creating a URL, we're creating a request from that URL. Before we do anything with the request, we need to create components, because components has query items on it. We're going to loop through the parameters, create query items from those parameters, add that to our query items array. We're going to set that array to the query items property on the components. From there, we're going to convert those query items into a string. So we're converting it into a string right here and turning that right here, and we're turning that string into data. That data will then be passed into the HTTP body as parameters, and then we're specifying what type of HTTP method we're using. We're specifying the headers, and then we're doing the data task, which is essentially going out to the internet. We want to make sure that we're always on the main thread when we are using any of this data. So we're going to wrap it in dispatch queue. We're going to check the responses just so that we can see what's going on. We're going to check if there was an error. If so, we're going to pass in that completion handler saying that it failed. Then what we're going to do is we're going to try to unwrap this data, make sure that there is data on it. If we can turn that data into JSON, then we should be good to continue on and try to turn it into a user. If we do succeed at turning it into a user, we're done. We're good. We can call this completion handler right here. If we can't turn it into a user, we're going to try to turn it into an error response. If we can't turn that into an error response, we get the catch block right here. If we can turn it into an error response, then we're going to create that error response, or we're going to have that error response turn into an actual error, which we can pass through to our completion handler as a failure. So I hope that does make sense. So once again, if any of this is confusing, just reach out to me on YouTube and I will definitely try to explain it a little bit better. So now we have our result back over here, and what we want to do is we want to switch on this result and do different things. If we're able to get the user object, then we want to be able to do our segue. If we're unable to get our user object, then we should be getting back an error, and we want to use our alert service to present that error. And remember, since we're going to be in a closure, we're going to be using a weak reference to self. All right, so as you can see, I used the capture list just to make sure that we're capturing a weak reference to self. And then right here, we're using our result because remember that our result is an enum. We're switching off of it. So in the case of a success, we should be only passing through a user. So we're going to just call that let user. And if we're able to create that user, then what we're going to do is we're just going to call our segue. Mine is called login segue, and we're going to pass the user as the sender. And since we're passing it as the sender in our prepare for Segue, you'll actually see that I'm making sure that we're going to the main app view controller. That's our Segway's destination, and that we're unwrapping the sender as a user. And then we're just simply setting that main app VC to user. Now, if we do get an error for whatever reason, then we're just going to go ahead, make an alert, and we're going to present that alert in our view controller. So let's go ahead and run this and let's see if everything's working as we expect it to. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to just go ahead and try to log in without passing any information. And we're actually getting back an error. So the data couldn't be read because it isn't in the correct format. So we're getting back something. Now, if we go back over to our console, we should see that it's having the same error. Now, notice that the data type couldn't be read because it isn't in the correct format is not the same error that we're getting back. We should be getting back username or password is incorrect. Please try again. So I think there is a problem with actually the error response, and I just checked it right now because I wasn't really sure why it wasn't working. So what we want to do is we actually want to delete this error property off of it because it's giving us some problems, and I'm just going to set the code to 0. So now let's go ahead and run that and see if it works this time. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and try it. We're going to log in, and we're getting closer to the error that we want back. So error username or password is incorrect. Please try again. So we're getting closer, but it has all that junk. So let's go ahead and clear that up. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to delete this extension. And I'm going to make this struct actually conform to the error protocol itself so that we can pass it directly. So we want it to be an error, but we want it to be a localized error. And localized error, it has a property on it called error description. So all we want to do is we just want to return the reason. And if we do that, now what we need to do is we need to go back over to our networking service. And instead of returning the error value, we're going to return the error response itself. And I think that should work. We should be able to run everything and see the error description that we were expecting from the first place. So let's go ahead and do log in. And as you can see, we're now getting back the correct error response. Username or password is incorrect. Please try again. So perfect. So let's go ahead and add in my credentials and let's see if we're able to log in correctly. So we have Kilo Loco, pass 123, and we're going to go down to the login button. We hit login and we're still hitting some type of problem. So the data couldn't be read because it is missing. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're seeing. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that my user object is all lined up properly. We have the ID. Oh, see, look at that. Might be the problem right there. ID is a string. We want to change that into an integer because look at what's coming back, an integer. So I had accidentally had the user have an ID of type string. Let's try this one more time. I think everything else should be cleared up by now, and we should be able to actually log into our app. So let me do Kilo Loco, and our password is pass123, but let's add a 4 on there. Make sure that we're still getting back our error. We get back our error. Now let's try it with the correct passcode, which is pass123. We're going to try to log in, and now we actually get into our app. So I know that this was an extremely long video, but I think it was well worth it. We covered essentially everything that you need to do in order to be able to log into your app. I think that it was actually beneficial to show you that I was kind of running into errors. I had to go back and change a couple of things because I got back, a couple of things that I didn't expect. It's been a while since I had to write a networking layer like from scratch with the bare bones, but this is kind of how you do it. Now, what we want to do is we want to kind of just make it so that we're able to do the same exact thing, but we want to be able to send like an encoded object, right? So this will actually be fairly quick now that we have a majority of the functionality built out. All we need to do is we need to go ahead and abstract away the parts that we're going to actually be using, which is everything in here, which is going to be our request. So let's go ahead and abstract away everything that we're doing to handle our request. So all we want to do is we want to make sure that we're going to pass in a request to a new function called handle response. And that's going to essentially take in the request that we created, and it's going to take in a completion handler, which is going to be the exact same type of completion handler here. All right, so now that we have this handle response, what we can do is we can go back down here after we're about to pass in the task, or after we finish adding the headers to the request, and we could just grab all this code down here and add it into that new function that we created, because we're actually going to be using the same functionality for both types of request methods. So now all we need to do is we need to make sure we're doing handle response, and we're passing it into this request function right here. All right, so we're able to pass in the request right here, and then we're able to pass in the completion because it has the same type of completion signature as up here. So we're able to continue and pass that all through. And I'm actually going to put these on separate lines just so that it's a little bit cleaner, just like the other one. And now what we want to do is we want to create another request that allows us to pass in an actual encoded object. So for this specific tutorial, I'm actually going to make it accept, instead of parameters, we want to be able to accept a login request, or a login object essentially that will handle which parameters we're supposed to be passing to it, which is going to be encodable. So what we'll do is we're going to copy all this functionality right here. We're going to create a new function that's almost exactly like it. And now instead of parameters, what we want to do is we want to have login object, and then we're going to pass in a login request, login object. We'll just pass in a login, and we need to create an object for that. All right, so now that we have this new object called login, which is conforming to the encodable protocol and also has the two properties that we're going to be needing to pass into our API, which is just simply the username and password, what we can do is we can go back over to our networking service. This is now going to have a login object, and we're no longer going to need to create components right here. So what we can do is we can get rid of all this code right here that we were using to create components, and instead what we want to do is we want to create data directly from that login object that we're passing right here. So let's do that now. All right, so as you can see, what we did was we added this new do catch block, and all we're going to do is we're going to pass, since we're passing in this login object, we're going to create data from that login object using a JSON encoder, and we're just going to encode our login object. If we're able to do that, then we can just set that data directly to the HTTP body. If we aren't able to do that, then what we're going to do is we're going to have a new error pop up that says bad encoding. So let's go ahead and go back over to our view controller. And what we're going to do, let's go back, not to the main app, but the login view controller. And instead of having all this information in here, the way that we're doing it, let's create two new functions so that we can separate the different types of requests that we can do. But before I do that, I also forgot to change the type of content that we're going to be passing. So we're no longer passing URL encoded data. What we want to do is we want to say application JSON, because we're actually going to be passing JSON as the request. It's no longer going to be form data. So now that we have it set as JSON, when we go ahead and go back over to our login view controller and we create those two functions, everything should work out pretty smoothly. All right, so as you can see in the did tap login button, what we did was we took all that functionality out of here that's doing the networking request, and we're actually just pasting it in here. Now we created this function right here called form data request just to distinguish which type of request we're doing, depending on what your backend is accepting. Some accept both, some accept only one or the other. So if you're doing a form data request, then this is the request that we're going to want to do. But and we're going to just do it just like we did before. But if we're going to be doing a JSON request, we need to create a login object and pass that to the new request method that we did in our networking service. So let's do that now. All right, so now that we created the login object from our username and password, we're just going to use our new request method, which is also taking an endpoint, but instead of parameters, it's taking in a login object, and then everything after that point is going to be the exact same. Now I'm going to keep it this way just so that it's easier to see, because most likely you're only going to be using one or the other, so you can just keep the code the way that it is. But you know, if we were going to end up keeping it like this, what you could do is you could extract all this out into a new function, which is just going to handle the result itself. But let's go ahead and remember that we only have the form data request currently selected. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that the form data request is still working as we expect it to. Make sure that the error handling is working, make sure that the proper login is working, and then we'll switch over to the JSON. So this is going to be the form data test. First, we're going to try to log in. We're still getting the correct error message. Let's do the correct login credentials. All right, and we log in. So we're saying, welcome, Kyle. Looking pretty good, pretty good, pretty good. So now let's try to do the same thing with the JSON request, where we're actually encoding the objects into JSON before we send it up. All right, so we want to try to log in, see if the error is still working. Still getting the correct error. Awesome. Now let's do the correct credentials. All right, so those are the correct credentials, and let's try to log in, and bam, welcome, Kyle. So that's all we need to know. That's everything that we're going to cover today. This was a long enough video. If you liked it, make sure that you share it with as many people as you possibly can. Sorry it was so long, but as you can see, there's a lot of little steps that go in between. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought about the video. If there's any other topics you want covered, leave a comment in the description, and you know what, just go out there, keep coding passionately.